Many people in the Terraria community will argue that Golem through Moonlord, also known as the late game, is the most poorly designed stage of the game by far, including myself. There are just so many things, big and small, that make the late game less enjoyable than every other stage of progression. But just like anything else, I'm sure it could be improved upon or possibly even fixed. So that got me to thinking, how could Terraria's late game be fixed? Let's talk about it. The first thing that would need to happen is a complete rework for Golem. His drops are actually pretty good, that's not the problem. The issue with Golem is, of course, the gameplay. This boss fight is boring, easy, frustrating, and spammy, which are all things that should never go together but somehow do. The reason I think this boss would need a complete rework rather than a buff is simply because increasing his stats would not make the problem better. Golem already has plenty of health, and he has okay damage. The issue is that his attacks are so simple and easy to dodge that it doesn't matter, and whenever you do get hit, it barely feels fair in the first place. Relogic kinda shot themselves in the foot by forcing Golem into the Jungle Temple arena. They can't give the boss fight even more projectiles because it would just be unjustifiable with how small an unlucky arena can be, but without buffing the boss at all, he's going to remain a joke in the game's progression forever. Golem has definitely been improved since his introduction in 1.2, but he still isn't very good for the game. He definitely needs a rework. Terraria's late game needs a lot more than a Golem rework though. Another issue with this stage of the game is the lack of content in between Golem and then the lunatic cultists. Beating Plantera unlocks all of the new dungeon gear, the 2 best events in the entire game, the best pre-Moonlord armor sets for 3 out of the 4 classes, and many of the best weapons in the game. Beating Golem unlocks Martian Madness. By the time you defeat Golem, you will more than likely have all of the gear you need to take on the endgame, and as a result, the pacing feels way too fast around this point of the game. In order to make Terraria's late game better, there needs to be more non-boss related gear in between Golem and the lunatic cultists. This could be as simple as locking more content behind Golem instead of Plantera. Make it so that the Frost Moon and the Pumpkin Moon are only available after Golem, or even restrict the Empress of Light to a later stage of the game, and the pacing immediately becomes better. The player does not need a huge jump in power after Plantera, especially because Golem is already an easier boss fight than most in the game. The player does, however, need a big boost in strength after Golem, since the Celestial Pillars and even the Lunatic Cultist himself is a huge challenge to take on. Locking more content behind a later stage of the game sounds counterintuitive, but I think it would actually improve the late game's pacing by a lot. Moving on to the Celestial Pillars, this event needs some changes. There's no other way to put it. I'm not often one to say that something straight up needs a buff or a nerf, but I will say that I think the Celestial Pillars absolutely need a nerf. Having to kill 100 enemies per pillar to open up the shield is extremely repetitive and annoying on higher difficulties, especially because it doesn't even end the event. Not only are the enemies way too tanky for their own good, but some of them do absurd damage and the spawn rates are insane. Even a small change like making the shield disappear at 50 or 75 enemies instead of 100 would be a huge improvement. I get that 100 is the cooler number, but the Celestial Pillars have no need to be as long as they currently are. I would also suggest decreasing the amount of health that a lot of these enemies have because they are way too tanky, but hey, that might be going too far. Oh yeah, and I might be a little bit biased when I say this since I do play with the melee class in most playthroughs, but get rid of the Kraltapede. Punishing players for flying in an event with a million enemies on the ground is very unnecessary and stupid. The Celestial Pillars as a whole are the worst kind of difficult. I can enjoy a challenge when it's well designed, but the Celestial Pillars are full of obnoxious, tanky, and spammy enemies. A problem with late game Terraria in general is honestly that a lot of the quote-unquote challenge just comes from ridiculous projectile spam. Golem, the Lunatic Cultists, and Moonlord are all guilty of relying on a bunch of projectiles that are nearly unpredictable rather than well-designed and engaging combat like many other boss fights in the game. I think that if Terraria reworked Golem, added more content before the Lunatic Cultists, and tweaked the Celestial Pillars a little bit, the late game would be just as fun as any other stage of the game. I would also like to see some changes made to Moonlord, but I know that many people love that boss fight, so maybe it's better if it remains the same. Would you change anything about late game Terraria as well, or do you think it's fine as it is? Make sure to leave your thoughts in the comments and subscribe to the channel because we are on our way to 3,000 and I could use your help. Alright, bye bye.